The first thing Clara Whitmore did when Sheriff Dale Huckett grabbed her arm in the middle of Dust Hallow's main street was nothing. She did not scream. She did not pull away. She stood exactly where she was and let him squeeze until she could feel the bones in her wrist shifting against each other. And she looked at him with the kind of eyes that had already decided nothing he did would ever be worth the energy of fear. "Move along," Huckett said, loud enough for the dozen people watching from storefronts and wagon seats to hear every word. "We don't take in strays here. Whatever hole you crawled out of, crawl back." The crowd did not flinch. Some of them nodded. Clara looked down at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked back up at his face. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Not charity." He let go then, not because she had moved him, but because holding a woman who refused to react made him look like exactly what he was. He stepped back and adjusted his hat, and said something under his breath that she did not bother trying to catch. She picked up the canvas bag she had dropped when he grabbed her and walked forward. If you've ever been the person a whole town decided didn't belong before you even opened your mouth, you already know what Clara was carrying that day. Not just the bag, not just the single coin she had sewn into the hem of her coat so it wouldn't rattle, something heavier, something that doesn't have a clean name. This is her story. And I promise you, it goes somewhere you won't expect. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, please do, right now, before the story pulls you under and you forget. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to know how far this has traveled. I check every single one. Stay with me. This one matters. The saloon in Dust Hallow was called the Threadneedle, which made no sense for a place that served whiskey and smelled like sawdust and old tobacco, but nobody had ever bothered to change the sign, and after a while names stopped meaning what they once meant anyway. Clara pushed through the swing door at 2:15 in the afternoon when the place was half empty, and the bartender was polishing a glass that would never truly be clean. She did not sit at the bar. She stood in the middle of the room, in the open space between the card tables and the door, and she waited. The bartender, a wide man named George, with a brown mustache going gray at the corners, looked at her the way he looked at everything that came through that door, with the flat, waiting expression of a man who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. "I'm looking for whoever posts the work notices," Clara said. "I saw a board outside. 3 of the cards were turned over, and I didn't want to assume." George set the glass down. "Turned over means the work's been filled." "I know what turned over means," she said without heat. "I'm asking about the ones still face up." He looked at her for another moment. The 2 men at the nearest card table had stopped pretending to play and were openly watching. Clara did not turn to acknowledge them. "Mercer Ranch had a card up," George said finally. "Household work, but that one's been up so long the ink's fading. 6 brothers out there, and not a one of them's been able to keep help more than a week." "Why not?" He shrugged. "Take your pick. Some say they're rough to work for. Some say the place is too far from town for a decent person to want to stay. Some say the house itself is so far gone it's not worth saving." He paused. "Some say they're just too stubborn to let anyone help them." "That sounds like a job, not a warning," Clara said. George looked at her differently after that. Not with warmth exactly, but with the particular attention a man gives when something doesn't match what he expected. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight?" he asked. "Not yet." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I got a corner in the storeroom. No bed. Flour sacks if you need something under you. You can have it one night if you're willing to clear tables in the morning." "I'll take it," she said, "and I'll clear the tables." She did not thank him effusively. She did not make it into a moment. She simply said those 6 words and moved to a chair near the wall and sat down. And George went back to his glass, and the 2 card players went back to their cards, and the Threadneedle settled back into its ordinary quiet. But something had shifted. Even the men at the table felt it, though neither of them could have said what it was. Clara Whitmore had not begged. She had not softened herself or made herself smaller or performed the kind of helplessness that sometimes moved people to generosity. She had simply stated what she needed and agreed to what was offered, and in doing so she had done something rarer in Dust Hallow than almost any other act she could have chosen. She had treated the exchange like it was between equals. She left for the Mercer Ranch before dawn. George had given her directions the night before. written on the back of a supply order, in handwriting that staggered across the page like it was trying to escape, and she had read them once, tucked the paper into the bag, and did not look at it again. She had always been able to hold a route in her mind once she had seen it. It was one of the things she was good at that she rarely mentioned, because in her experience, telling people you were good at things before they saw it themselves was one of the most reliable ways to make them determined to disagree. The road out of town was a dirt path that became a wagon trail, that became, eventually, something that was mostly two ruts in the earth, with ambitions of being a road. The land was flat near Dust Hallow, and then wasn't. By the time the sky started going pale at the edges, Clara was deep enough into the open country that she could no longer hear anything from town. No roosters, no early hammering, no voices. Just the wind moving through the dry grass, and somewhere off to her left, the far sound of cattle. She found the ranch as the light went gold. It was bigger than she had expected. Not rich. That was clear from a distance. The main house was solid but weathered, the kind of construction that had been done with care a long time ago and then maintained unevenly, so that some parts of it looked nearly fine, and others showed the slow creep of neglect. There were outbuildings, a barn with one wall that had been patched twice in visible stages, a corral that held a dozen horses, and pens beyond that where the sounds of cattle carried on the cold morning air. She stood at the edge of the property and looked at all of it for a moment. Then she walked to the front door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. A long pause. Then a voice from inside, rough with sleep and annoyance. "It's not even sunup." "I know," Clara said. "That's when the day starts." Another pause, this one different in quality. Then the sound of boots on a wood floor, uneven, someone moving without hurry, and the door opened. The man in the doorway was tall, not in a way that seemed accidental, but in a way that suggested he had been built for this land specifically, that his height was a tool the same way his hands were tools. Dark hair still creased from sleep, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He was somewhere in his late 30s, and his eyes, once they focused, were the particular shade of gray that does not look soft in any light. "Wyatt Mercer?" Clara asked. "Depends," he said. "Who's asking?" "Clara Whitmore. George at the Threadneedle told me you had a card up for household work. I'm here about the position." Wyatt Mercer looked at her the way people look at things that arrive earlier or differently than they planned for. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply assessing. "It's not dawn," he said again. "I know. I walked out from town this morning. I'd rather be early than miss the conversation." She paused. "If the position is already filled, I'll walk back. No harm done." "It's not filled," he said. "Then I'd like to talk about it." He looked past her, out at the empty approach, as though expecting to find someone else she had brought with her. There was no one. She had arrived alone, on foot, before the sun was properly up, with a canvas bag and an expression that gave nothing unnecessary away. He stepped back from the door. "Come in, then," he said. The inside of the house confirmed what the outside had suggested. It was not dirty, exactly. None of the Mercer brothers were the kind of men who lived in filth. But there is a difference between clean and cared for, and this house had not been cared for in a long time. The kitchen had dishes stacked in a functional arrangement that had nothing to do with efficiency. The table had the remains of the previous evening's meal pushed to one side to make room for a harness repair that was still in progress. The floor had been swept but not washed, and the windows were so filmed with dust and grease smoke that the morning light came through them gray and flat. Clara stood in the main room and looked at all of it without comment. Wyatt moved to the stove and started building a fire, working with the automatic competence of a man who had done the same thing every morning for years and never once found it anything but necessary. "The others will be up soon," he said. "You should know what you're looking at before you agree to anything. 5 brothers. We do our own outdoor work. The house is what we can't seem to get ahead of." He paused. "We've had 4 women in this position in the past 18 months. None of them stayed." "Why not?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because this isn't an easy place to be. And 6 men who've lived alone long enough develop habits that aren't easy to live around." He glanced at her. "I'm telling you that now so you don't feel deceived later." What kind of habits? She asked. We don't ask for help. We fix what we can fix and ignore what we can't, and sometimes the line between those two gets confused. He struck a match and held it to the kindling. And we've never been good at letting someone else set the terms in our own house. I'm not interested in setting terms, Clara said. I'm interested in work. What kind of work have you done before? She did not hesitate, but she also did not answer immediately. There was a half-second where something moved behind her eyes, the kind of brief recalibration that happens when a person is deciding not how to lie, but how much of the truth to give. Enough kinds, she said. I've kept houses, I've managed supplies, I know how to stretch a larder, and I know how to organize a kitchen that feeds more people than it was meant to. I know basic mending, and I can do a full accounting of what a household spends if you need it. She paused. I'm better at things that need thinking through than things that need muscle, though I'm not helpless in either category. Wyatt looked at her steadily. You're not from here. No. Where from? East, she said. Farther east than this. That's all that matters for the job. He could have pushed. He didn't. Something about the way she said it, not defensive, not shutting him out, just final, made him recognize that the door on that subject was closed for reasons she had decided on, and that pressing it would only tell him what kind of man he was, not what kind of woman she was. 1 week, he said. We'll pay for 1 week's work and see where things stand. 1 week is fine, she said. If it's not working by then, I'll leave without making it difficult. And if it is working, then we'll talk about a second week, she said. He almost smiled. It did not quite make it to his face, but the shape of it was there. The fire caught. The kitchen began, very slowly, to warm. The brothers came down one by one, which told Clara something about the internal architecture of the house. Not the building, but the living arrangement, the unspoken social structure of 6 men sharing a space without anyone designated to smooth it. The second one down was broader than Wyatt, and younger by what looked like 3 or 4 years, with the same dark hair but more of it, and a face that defaulted to suspicion in the way some faces default to friendliness. His name was Cole, and he stopped at the bottom of the stair and looked at Clara the way he might look at a new animal that had appeared in the corral overnight. "Who's this?" he asked, directing the question at Wyatt. "Clara Whitmore," Wyatt said. "She's here about the household position." "At this hour?" "I walked from town," Clara said. She did not say it apologetically. She said it as a fact. Cole looked at her for a long moment. "You stay in the house, or you go back to town at night?" "I'll need somewhere on the property," she said. "I'm not walking 4 miles each way every day." "There's a room at the back," Wyatt said, "off the kitchen. It's been used for storage, but it's got a window and a door that locks." Clara nodded. "That's fine." "You sure?" Cole said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite a challenge, but was adjacent to one. A kind of testing, the way men test things they're uncertain about, not to be cruel, but because they've learned that things that seem solid sometimes aren't, and they'd rather find out now. "I've slept in worse," Clara said, and said it so plainly, without drama or self-pity, that Cole had nothing to pull on. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said nothing. Cole went to the stove and poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, shifting the harness repair out of his way without looking at it. The other 4 came down over the next 20 minutes. Each one entered the kitchen to find a stranger sitting at their table and had to process that information in real time, and each one did it differently. Thomas, the third oldest, asked her name and shook her hand and said little else. James and Henry arrived together, clearly used to moving as a pair, and exchanged a look when they saw her that Clara could not entirely read but catalogued for later. The youngest, a boy named Eli, who could not have been more than 19 and still had the unfinished look of someone who had not quite settled into his face, stopped in the doorway and stared with the unguarded surprise that only very young people or very honest ones manage. "Morning," Clara said to him. "Morning," he said, and came in and found a seat and tried not to look like he was still staring, and mostly failed. 6 brothers. 6 different ways of taking up space in a room. Clara looked at the kitchen. She looked at the table, the stove, the disorder of a household that had been running on pure functional momentum for too long, where every system had calcified into whatever it had become because there was never enough time or energy or inclination to build something better. She did not say anything yet. She watched how they moved. She watched who poured coffee for himself and who waited. She watched who sat where, whether those were chosen seats or default ones, whether the arrangement was easy or slightly effortful. She watched what each of them did in the first 5 minutes of the day before the requirements of the day took over. In 20 minutes, she had a clearer picture of this household than the 4 women before her had likely managed in their first week. Not because she was exceptional at reading people, though she was, but because she had spent enough of her life in situations where reading people quickly was not a skill but a necessity. And necessity is the most efficient teacher there is. She started that first morning with the kitchen. Not dramatically. She did not announce what she was doing or ask for permission. She simply, once the brothers had eaten and gone to their various morning tasks, moved through the kitchen with the deliberate attention of someone who is building a map in their mind. She opened every cabinet. She checked every shelf. She looked at what they had and what they didn't, what was in the right place, and what had migrated to wherever it had landed the last time someone needed it in a hurry. The larder was badly organized, but not badly stocked. Someone, probably Wyatt, she thought, based on what she had seen of him, had been buying supplies in bulk without a system for rotating or tracking them. So there were 4 different bags of cornmeal in various stages of depletion stacked in no particular order, a box of salt that had been opened from the wrong end and resealed badly, canned goods pushed to the back where nobody could see what was there without pulling everything out, and a persistent smell of something sweet and slightly wrong that turned out to be a jar of molasses with a cracked lid being slowly colonized by ants. She disposed of the molasses. She pulled everything off the shelves. She laid it out on the cleared table and sorted it, what was good, what was marginal and needed using soon, what was already past saving. And by noon she had a working inventory of every item in the larder, written in her clear, angular hand on a piece of paper she had found folded blank in a drawer. Then she put everything back, but differently, with a logic to it. Henry came in for water at about noon and stopped short when he saw the larder shelves. He stood there for a moment looking at the arrangement, and Clara could see him trying to identify what had changed and why it looked different, and whether it was better or worse than what it had been. "I moved some things," she said, from the table where she was still working on the inventory. "I can see that," he said. "Everything's still there. I threw out the molasses because it had ants in it, but I wrote it on the list so whoever buys supplies knows to get more." She paused. "If you want it put back the way it was, I can do that too." Henry looked at the shelves for another moment. He had a quality she hadn't fully identified yet. Quieter than Cole, less formal than Wyatt, with the kind of watchful intelligence that doesn't announce itself. "No," he said. "This is easier to read." He filled his cup and went back out. Clara wrote the last item on the inventory list and set the pen down and looked out the kitchen window at the land stretching away from the house, the wide, difficult, relentless land, and allowed herself half a breath of something that was not quite relief, but was close enough to its neighborhood to rest in for a moment. She had not been turned out. She had not made an error. She had made herself useful in a way that was visible but not theatrical, and no one had told her to stop. One morning, that was all it was. She folded the inventory list, set it where the cooking supplies were stored, and went to find what else needed doing. The trouble started that afternoon. Not with Wyatt. Not with Cole or Henry, or even the watchful pair of James and Henry. It started with Eli, the youngest, who came in from the barn at 3 o'clock with mud on his boots and a long scratch on the back of his right hand that he was ignoring with the particular determination of a 19-year-old boy who has decided that acknowledging a wound is the same as admitting weakness. Clara was in the main room, assessing a pile of clothing she had gathered from various surfaces around the house. Shirts left over chairbacks, a pair of work pants folded over a porch railing, things that needed mending in ways that were obvious to look at and had simply been left that way because no one had time or inclination to do anything about them. She saw the scratch immediately. "Sit down," she said. Eli stopped. "What?" "The scratch on your hand. Sit down and let me look at it." He looked at his hand as though he had forgotten it was there. It's nothing. It's going to be infected if you don't clean it, she said. The edge of that scratch is already looking wrong. What did it? A nail, he said, with the slightly defensive tone of a person who knows they should have been more careful and doesn't want that pointed out. In the barn. Old nail, stuck out of a board I was moving. Clara had already moved to the kitchen. She came back with a cloth and a small bottle she had found in the first aid supplies, which had been in a box under the kitchen counter, chaotically organized, mixed in with boot polishing supplies and a broken pocket watch and several loose nails of the exact type that had apparently caused the problem. Sit, she said again. He sat. Not comfortably, not willingly, but he sat, which was what mattered. She cleaned the scratch with the efficiency of someone who has done this kind of thing before. Not for show, not talking him through it, or softening the sting with commentary, just working. Eli hissed once through his teeth when the cloth made contact with the deepest part of the cut. Hold still, she said. That's easy for you to say, he muttered. It is, she agreed. He almost laughed despite himself. You're not what I expected, he said. She finished cleaning the scratch and checked it again in the light. What did you expect? He shrugged, which was difficult while holding his arm steady. I don't know. Someone who'd need things explained. Someone who'd ask a lot of questions about how we do things. I watched how you do things this morning, Clara said. That's faster than asking. He was quiet for a moment, watching her wrap a strip of clean cloth around his hand. You watched us? Everyone does, in a new place. It's how you figure out where you fit. And where do you fit? He asked. It was a genuine question, young enough, honest enough to ask it without guile. Clara finished the wrapping and tied it off. She looked at the job for a moment, then she looked at him. I don't know yet, she said. Give me the week. Dinner that evening was the first real test. Not of her cooking, though that was part of it. The test was whether 6 men who had arranged themselves around a table every evening in patterns that had calcified over months or years would permit a stranger to alter that arrangement without it becoming a conflict. Clara had spent the afternoon building a meal from what was available. Not elaborate. She was working with a kitchen she had spent only half a day in, from a larder that had serious gaps in it, but considered. She made a beef stew from the better cut of the meat she found hanging in the cold space off the back porch, combined with the dried vegetables she had reorganized that morning into a form where she could actually see what was there. She made cornbread from the first opened bag of cornmeal that needed using. She boiled coffee, and she set the table actually set it, with plates and utensils in the right positions, a clean cloth over the worst of the staining on the wood, and she had all of it ready at 6 o'clock, which she had determined from watching the previous evening's chaos was approximately when the brothers expected food to appear. They came in from outside in stages. Each one stopped for a fractional second when they saw the table, but only one of them said anything. Cole. Of course it was Cole. We don't usually eat like this, he said. Like what? Clara asked. He gestured at the table. Like there's company. You're not company, she said. You're the people who live here. This is just how a table looks when it's set properly. Cole looked at it again, then at her. Then he sat down in his usual chair. She could tell it was usual by the ease with which he moved to it, and said nothing further. They ate. And something happened at that table that evening that Clara could not have planned for and would not have predicted. It was nothing dramatic. None of them made speeches. None of them said anything that would read as significant out of context. But somewhere between the first bowl of stew and the last piece of cornbread, the silence at the table changed. It had been for years the silence of people who have run out of things to say to each other, or who have never learned to say them. The silence of a family that has been reduced to pure function, where the mechanism of living together has been maintained at the cost of the actual living. By the end of the meal, it was something else. Not warmth, not yet. That would take longer than one dinner. But possibility. The small, fragile, easily destroyed sense that things might be otherwise. Eli talked first. He described his afternoon in the barn, the project he was working on, with a specificity and animation that suggested he didn't often get drawn out on the details of his days. Henry asked a question. Wyatt answered something that Cole had been about to answer, and Cole, instead of being irritated, modified what he had been about to say to add something the others hadn't known. Clara listened. She refilled coffee cups when they were empty, and she did not insert herself into the conversation because this was not her conversation to be part of. Not yet. But she listened. And she learned. After the table was cleared and the dishes were done, she would not let Eli help, though he offered. He had one good hand and she didn't need the assistance. She went to the storeroom off the kitchen that Wyatt had said was her room. It was exactly what he had described. Storage mostly. A few boxes pushed to the walls, a single window that faced north and let in the cold, a narrow cot frame without a mattress, which she had half expected. She found folded canvas in one of the boxes that would serve well enough for a night. She sat on the edge of the cot frame and looked at the wall. She had not slept in a place she thought of as her own in a long time. She was not sure she thought of this as hers. It was too early for that, and she had learned in ways she would not revisit tonight, not to let herself believe in permanence too quickly. But she was here. She had a room with a door that locked. She had done work today, and the work had mattered, in the small, specific ways that work matters when it serves a real purpose. She unlaced her boots. Then she stopped. She looked at them, the laces half undone, the familiar weight of them in her hands. She was so accustomed to sleeping in her boots that the act of removing them felt, in this particular moment, like a small and private risk she hadn't entirely decided whether to take. She took them off. She set them beside the cot where she could reach them. Then she lay back on the folded canvas and looked at the ceiling of the storeroom in the Mercer ranch and let herself close her eyes. And the last thing she thought before sleep took her was not about the brothers or the kitchen or the inventory list or what tomorrow would require. It was this. One day. She had made it through one day. Outside, the wind moved across the frontier in its old, indifferent way, and the land did not care about any of it, and the darkness sat on the ranch like a weight, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted in its stall, and somewhere at the edge of the property, in a stand of dry trees, something that was not the wind moved briefly and went still. Clara Whitmore was already asleep. She did not hear it. But in the morning she would notice the tracks in the dirt at the property line, and she would know that whatever peace this place appeared to offer had something watching it from the edge, something that had not yet decided to move closer. And she would say nothing. Not yet. Because she had learned a long time ago that the right moment for a warning is never the first moment you see the danger. It is the moment you understand what the danger actually wants. She found the tracks on her second morning. She had risen before the brothers, which was becoming the shape of her days already, the way some habits form in a single repetition when the conditions are right. The storeroom off the kitchen held the cold badly, and the cold was what woke her, that particular hour before dawn when the temperature drops its last few degrees and the body, no matter how tired, decides sleeping is no longer the priority. She had pulled on her boots, laced them fully this time, out of something that was not quite comfort but was adjacent to it, and gone to the kitchen to start the stove. Then she had stepped outside to check the water barrel at the east side of the house, and she had seen them. Boot prints, deep-heeled, made by a man's boot with a worn left sole that left a distinct pattern in the soft dirt near the property fence. The prints went along the fence line and stopped at a point where someone had stood for a while. There were two deep impressions there, side by side, the kind left by a person who is not moving but is watching. And then they went back the way they had come, toward the stand of dry trees she had noticed the night before. She stood over the tracks for a long moment. The morning was gray and still, and the wind had not yet started. Then she went back inside and started the stove and said nothing. Not because she had decided the tracks were not important, because she had decided she needed more information before she said anything, and because walking into a household on her second morning and announcing that someone had been watching the property in the night was exactly the kind of statement that could go wrong in several directions at once. The brothers might dismiss her. They might already know about whoever was out there. They might react in ways that made things worse before she understood what the situation actually was. She knew how to wait. She had learned it the hard way, the way most useful things are learned. Wyatt came down first, same as the morning before. He moved to the stove and found it already lit and the coffee already started and stopped with a brief pause that told her this was still surprising to him, that the house being tended before he reached it was not yet ordinary. "You were up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep past the cold. The storeroom gets bad before dawn. We should have warned you." I managed, she said. She set a cup on the table. I need to ask you something. He sat. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Go ahead. The fence line on the east side. Is there someone who has reason to be walking it at night? He looked at her. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. A tightening, the kind that happens when a person hears something they were already half expecting. What did you see? He said. Boot prints, single person. They stopped near the line and stood there for a while. Left before dawn. He was quiet for several seconds. He looked at the table. He looked at the coffee in his cup. Then he looked back at her. You didn't say anything last night, he said. I didn't see them until this morning, she said. And when I did, I came inside and started the stove, and then I waited until I had a chance to tell you without the others in the room. He looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention that he gave things he was trying to accurately assess. Why without the others? He said. Because I don't know yet how each of your brothers handles news like that, and I didn't want to start something before I understood what I was starting, she said. That's your call to make, not mine. He set the cup down. He turned it slightly with one hand, a small movement, something to do while he was thinking. His name is Orrin Hale, Wyatt said. He owns the property south of us. Or he says he does. There's been a water rights dispute going on for the better part of 2 years. What kind of dispute? He claims a portion of our creek runs through his land and that we've been diverting it. We haven't. The creek runs where it's always run, and our claim on it goes back to when our father first filed. His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that takes work. But he's got a lawyer in Dust Hallow who has been filing papers for 2 years, and the county recorder is his wife's cousin, so every time we file a counterclaim, it takes 4 months to get a hearing. Clara absorbed this. And so he walks your fence line at night. He's done worse, Wyatt said. Last spring, 2 of our fence posts on the southern boundary were pulled and replaced about 3 feet east of where they'd been. We caught it because Cole rides that line every week. We moved them back and reset them ourselves, but by then, Hale had already sent someone to survey the land based on the new positions. Did you report it? To who? He said it without bitterness, but the question had a weight behind it that told her this was not the first time he had asked it. Sheriff Huckett is... I've met Sheriff Huckett, Clara said. Wyatt looked at her. Then you know. She did know. She thought of the hand on her wrist in the main street of Dust Hallow, the sound the crowd had made, which was no sound, the silence of people who have decided that what they are watching is not their problem. How long has this been going on? She asked. Since our mother died, he said, 3 years ago. Hale started the first claim 4 months after the funeral. He paused. She was the one who kept the paperwork. All the original land filings, the survey records, the water rights documentation. She kept everything in order. When she died, we went to find it, and... He stopped, his jaw tightened. It was there. Most of it. But some of it wasn't where it should have been, and we've never been sure whether she moved it before she died and we just can't find it, or whether someone got to it early. Clara was quiet for a moment. Someone meaning Hale. I don't have proof, he said. And that's exactly the problem. The other brothers were starting to stir upstairs. She could hear the floor creaking, the particular sound of boots being pulled on, the muffled thud of someone moving around a room that had too much in it. I'll look at whatever documentation you have, Clara said. If you want me to. I'm good with paperwork. I can tell you what you have, what you're missing, and what might be reconstructed from other sources. Wyatt looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration, the slow adjustment of an expectation being revised. That's not household work, he said. No, she agreed, but it's work that needs doing, and I'm here. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. Cole came downstairs first, and the conversation closed, and Clara went to the stove to check the coffee, and the morning moved forward with the ordinary momentum of mornings, and nothing was resolved, and everything was slightly different than it had been the day before. That was how things happen in places like this. Not in moments, in increments, in the accumulation of small shifts that you only recognized as a pattern when you had lived through enough of them. Clara understood this. She had been in enough situations where the only way forward was through the slow, unglamorous business of earning trust by installments. She could be patient, She had been patient before, in circumstances considerably worse than this. She poured Cole's coffee and did not mention the tracks. Not yet. The second day at the Mercer ranch started the same as the first, which was to say it started with 6 men trying to move through a kitchen at the same time, and all of them finding a way to do it that cost more effort than it should have. Clara watched this from the stove and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. She was building a picture of the inefficiency, not judging it, just mapping it, the way a person maps a room in the dark, touching walls to understand the shape. The problem, she had decided the previous day, was not that the brothers were incapable. Each of them was, in his own sphere of work, clearly competent. Wyatt ran the cattle operation with the quiet, systemic intelligence of a man who thought 3 seasons ahead. Cole managed the horses and did it well enough that the animals moved for him in ways that told you the relationship was built on something real. Henry kept the accounts, badly, as she would discover later, not from dishonesty, but from a system that had grown so organically and idiosyncratically over the years that it was nearly illegible to anyone but him. Thomas fixed things, mechanical things, with a patience and precision that Clara recognized as a genuine gift. James and Eli worked the boundary line and the general labor of the ranch with the unacknowledged coordination of people who have worked beside each other so long that the communication has gone mostly nonverbal. They were not incompetent, they were overwhelmed. There is a difference, and it matters in how you approach it. You cannot organize incompetence into function. You can, however, reorganize overwhelm into something manageable, if you do it carefully and without making people feel as though they are being managed. Clara had spent years learning exactly that distinction. She made a different breakfast on the second morning. Not elaborate, she was still learning the kitchen, still finding where things were and how the stove ran hot on the left side and needed adjusting for anything that required even heat, but different from the previous morning in that she had thought about it. Fried eggs and salt pork and the cornbread left from the previous evening, sliced and warmed in the pan, with coffee that she had made stronger than they were used to because she had seen, watching them the day before, that the afternoon energy drop started around 2 o'clock in a way that suggested the morning coffee was not doing the work it needed to. Nobody said anything about the stronger coffee, but by the end of the week she would notice that 2 o'clock passed differently. James sat across from Eli at the table, and they talked in the low, abbreviated way of people who don't need full sentences between them. Thomas read something. A pamphlet about fence repair, she thought, though she didn't look closely. Cole ate, standing at the counter, which she suspected was a preference rather than a space issue, and she said nothing about it because there was no reason to. Wyatt ate and did not talk and thought about something that was not in the room, which he did every morning, and Clara had filed this under not her business unless it became her business, and left it there. Henry came in last, which also seemed to be a pattern, and sat in the chair nearest the window and looked out at the land while he drank his coffee before he ate, and there was something about the way he did it, the quality of the looking, deliberate, and slightly melancholy, that told her there was more to Henry than the watchfulness he showed to the room. She stored that too. "I'll need to go to town today," she said, when the breakfast was mostly done and the morning's outdoor work was being assembled in people's heads. "The larder has gaps. I made a list." She set the inventory paper on the table. Wyatt looked at it. He turned it around once, as though reorienting himself to the handwriting, and then read through it. "This is more than gaps," he said. "It's a full inventory with what needs replacing marked," she said. "You can decide what to prioritize. I put them in order of urgency based on what I could see was running low, but you know this household better than I do." He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at her. "You did this yesterday?" "Yes." "While you were reorganizing the shelves?" "Yes." He handed the list to Cole, who read it with the same slightly resistant attention he gave most things she was involved in. Cole read it through once without expression, then read through the marked items again. "The salt situation is worse than this shows," Cole said, not to her, to Wyatt. "I used half a bag on the new fence post last month. Keeps the wood from—" He stopped, seeming to catch himself talking about something she wouldn't know. "It helps preserve the wood," he finished, redirecting it to a full sentence. "I didn't know that," Clara said. "Good to know. I'll add it to the list." Cole looked at her briefly, then back at Wyatt. There was something in the exchange that Clara observed without being entirely sure what it meant. Cole recalibrating slightly, adjusting something in how he was holding himself in relation to her. Not warmth, but something more like the absence of active resistance. Thomas offered to drive her to town in the wagon, which surprised her, because Thomas was a man of minimal social initiative. "I need to pick up parts from the hardware supplier anyway," he said, when her surprise must have shown slightly. "No point in 2 trips." "I'd appreciate it," she said. They left after morning chores. Thomas drove with the same focused quiet he brought to everything physical, and Clara sat beside him with the supply list and the money Wyatt had given her, counted out with care, enough for the necessities and not much beyond, and watched the land go by. "You're not going to ask me why I came here," she said, after they had been moving for a while. Thomas glanced at her. "No." "Why not?" He thought about this with the seriousness he seemed to bring to questions. "Because Wyatt already knows the answer doesn't matter for the job," he said. "And because whatever you're not saying is probably something you've decided not to say for a reason, and the reason is probably decent." Clara looked at the road ahead. "That's a generous reading." "Not really," he said. "It's just that I've noticed people who come from somewhere difficult mostly just want to work without having to explain the difficult part." He adjusted the reins slightly. "My mother was like that. Came from somewhere back east that she never talked about. Did good work. Loved this land." He paused. That was enough. Clara did not respond immediately. The wagon moved. The morning light was sharp and clean, and the land rolled away on both sides with its particular Western indifference, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have no interest in being looked at. "She sounds like she was something," Clara said. "She was," Thomas said simply, and then he said nothing else, and the silence that followed was the kind that does not need filling. In Dust Hallow, the morning was noisier and more crowded than her first arrival had suggested. There was a market day of some kind. Stalls set up along the main street, wagons parked at angles, a busy hum of exchange and argument, and the particular loud sociability of people who spend most of their lives in isolated stretches of land and make up for it when they get the chance to gather. Clara drew less attention today. She was in a wagon with a Mercer, which either helped or complicated things depending on who was watching, and she was on an errand with a list, which gave her the armor of purpose. She was halfway through the list at the general store when she heard her name. Not her real name, her full name, which she had only given to Wyatt and to George at the Threadneedle. "Clara Whitmore." She turned. The woman who had said it was somewhere in her 50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that has been weathered past the point of caring about it, and eyes that were too sharp to belong to someone who wasn't paying attention to everything in the room. "I'm Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "Edna Pruitt," the woman said. "I own the boarding house on the east end of town. George Neely told me about you." She paused. "Said you were going out to the Mercer ranch." "That's right." Edna looked at her with the open, unvarnished assessment of a woman who has seen a great deal and developed opinions about most of it. "You know what you're getting into out there." "More every day," Clara said. Edna made a sound that might have been a laugh. "They're not bad men," she said. "The Mercers. People in town have a tendency to let the difficulty of them overshadow the fact that they're decent. But they've had a hard 3 years and it's made them harder, and that's not always the same as bad, though it can look similar from a distance." "I've noticed," Clara said. "Orrin Hale has been making noise again," Edna said, and her voice dropped slightly, not conspiratorially, but with the deliberate adjustment of someone choosing not to be overheard. "Came in to see Pendleton, the lawyer, last week. Spent 2 hours." She paused. "Pendleton is not a man who spends 2 hours on something unless there's money in it." Clara set her list on the counter. "What kind of noise?" "I don't know specifics," Edna said. "I know that Hale's been buying drinks for the right people lately, and I know that Hale's wife visited the county recorder's office twice in the past month, and the clerk there talks to my boarder, and my boarder talks to me." She looked at Clara steadily. "I'm telling you this because I told the Mercers the same thing 6 months ago, and they did nothing with it, and I'm hoping a new pair of ears might do something different." Clara absorbed this. "Why do you care," she said, "about the Mercers?" Edna looked at her for a moment. Because Margaret Mercer was my friend for 20 years, she said, and those boys are what she left. There was nothing performative in the way she said it. It was simply a fact, stated as a fact, with all the weight that 20 years of friendship can carry. I'll pass it on, Clara said. Good, Edna said. She straightened up. You need anything in this town, you come to me. I don't have much pull, but I have ears, and ears are more useful than most people give them credit for. I know, Clara said. Thank you. Edna gave her one more look, the comprehensive kind, the kind that is filing information for later, and then moved away into the crowd of the market, and Clara turned back to her list, and the morning moved forward. But she drove back to the ranch with something additional to the supplies in the back of the wagon. She drove back with the clear and specific sense that whatever was pressing in on the Mercer ranch from the outside had been building deliberately, patiently, for a long time, and that whoever was behind it was not in a hurry because they believed time was working in their favor. Time usually did work in favor of people with lawyers and connections and county recorders who were their relatives. Unless someone changed the terms. She did not say anything to Thomas on the drive back. He was not the right person to start this conversation with, not yet. She needed to talk to Wyatt, and she needed to do it with the specific information from Edna placed carefully beside the specific information she already had. The tracks in the dirt, the missing documents, the water rights dispute. And she needed to do it in a way that did not make her sound like someone stirring up a problem. She was not stirring anything up. She was simply describing what was already there. That was always the difficulty. The things that most needed saying were the ones that people most wanted to believe weren't true. Back at the ranch, she unloaded supplies and restocked the larder with the logic she had built for it the day before, and she started dinner, and she waited. The opportunity came after the dishes were done, when the brothers dispersed into their evening habits. Cole to the barn, Henry to his accounting, Thomas and the two younger brothers to whatever occupied them in the hour before sleep. And Wyatt stayed at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and the look of a man who had been trying to solve the same problem for so long that the problem and the man had started to resemble each other. Edna Pruitt spoke to me in town today, Clara said. Wyatt looked up. He said nothing. She told me Hale met with Pendleton the lawyer last week, long meeting, and that Hale's wife has been to the county recorder's office twice in the past month. Wyatt turned the coffee cup. Once. Twice. She told me she told you similar things 6 months ago, Clara said. She did, he said. And? And we didn't have the money for a lawyer to respond to whatever Pendleton was filing, and by the time we had enough saved, the filing had already gone through. He said it flatly, not making excuses for himself, just laying out the sequence. And then the spring was bad, and we were fighting just to keep the herd stable, and the legal situation sat. Where are the documents you have? Clara asked. The ones your mother kept. He looked at her. Why? Because if Hale is moving through legal channels again, the documentation is what matters. A lawyer can file whatever Hale pays him to file, but if your original claim is in order and the evidence of your water rights is complete, it makes it significantly harder to argue against in front of a judge. She paused. And if there are gaps in what you have, the sooner you know what they are, the sooner you can figure out if they can be filled. He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to tell her he was actually thinking about it, not just waiting for a way to deflect. They're in a box, he said, in the room at the end of the upstairs hall. I put them there after we couldn't find the ones that were missing. I haven't looked at them since. Will you let me look at them? He studied her. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove settling and the sound of the wind beginning to move outside, finding the gaps in the walls the way wind always found gaps. This isn't what I hired you for, he said. I know, she said. But you said yourself the ranch isn't failing because of the land. If Hale succeeds in whatever he's trying to file, it won't matter how good the land is. His jaw worked slightly. The muscle at the corner of it moved the way muscles move when a person is holding something they are not ready to say. I'll get the box, he said. He went upstairs. He came back with a wooden box, the kind used for organizing correspondence, with a hinged lid and a rusted clasp that had not been opened in some time, judging by the effort it took him to undo it. He set it on the table between them. Clara opened it. The papers inside were not in bad shape, considering. They had been kept dry, which was the main thing. Water damage was the enemy of old documents more than anything else. Some of them had yellowed at the edges, and several had been folded and refolded enough times that the creases were soft and fragile. But the ink was legible and the paper was intact, and she spread them out carefully on the table and began to read. Wyatt did not hover. He moved to the other side of the table and sat down and watched her work, which was exactly the right thing to do, giving her space to think without removing his presence, which told her the box and its contents were not things he was comfortable leaving with a stranger in the room alone. She understood that. She didn't say so. She worked for the better part of an hour. The kitchen grew colder as the stove died down, and neither of them mentioned it, and at some point Wyatt got up and added wood to the fire without being asked and came back and sat down. "You have the original water rights filing," she said. "Dated clearly, your father's signature, the county stamp. It's all here. That's the most important piece." "But," he said, because there was a but. "But the survey documentation from when the land was first claimed is partial. There's a section that should show the creek boundary specifically, and the pages that would cover that section are not in this box." He was quiet. "That could be what Hale is working with," she said, "if he has a copy of the survey, even a partial one, even one that he's altered in some way, and you can't produce the full original to counter it, then in a hearing it becomes his document against your incomplete record." "So we're missing the key piece," he said. "You're missing the piece that covers the specific contested area," she said. "That's different from missing the key piece, though it might not feel different right now." She paused. Survey documentation from that period was filed in multiple places. The county recorder holds one copy, but there should also be a copy with the original land office that granted the claim, and sometimes a third copy was filed with the territorial government. "The county recorder is Hale's wife's cousin," Wyatt said. "Yes. So that copy we assume is compromised." She kept her voice level. "But the territorial office in the capital is not Hale's territory. If the copy exists there, it exists independently of anything he can reach." Wyatt looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at them the way people look at things that represent a problem they have been carrying so long it has started to feel like part of them. "You figured all this out in an hour," he said. "I figured out the shape of it," she said. "Whether it leads anywhere real is a different question." She began to carefully restack the papers in order, but the shape of it is actually better than I expected when I opened the box. He watched her hands moving over the documents. "Where did you learn to read legal papers like that?" The pause before her answer was brief. "Not guilty, just calibrated." "I've had reasons to read them," she said. "That's all." He didn't push it. He had seen already that pushing it was not the way in. "I'll write to the territorial office," he said. "First thing tomorrow." "I can draft the letter if you tell me what to ask for," she said. "I write formally when I need to." He looked at her for a moment. That same steady, recalibrating look that she was becoming familiar with, the look of a man who keeps encountering something he did not anticipate and is trying to decide how to categorize it. "Clara says," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without any formal prefix. "Why are you doing this? The household work is one thing, but this—" He gestured at the papers. She finished stacking the documents and closed the lid of the box and looked at him directly. "Because it needs doing," she said, "and because I'm good at it, and because if Hale wins whatever he's trying to win, there are 6 of you who lose what your parents built, and I've seen what it looks like when someone loses that, and I don't want to be in a place where I watched it happen and did nothing about the part I could have helped with." It was more than she had meant to say. She could feel it as the words finished. The slight exposure of having said something true that she had not fully intended to share. Wyatt held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the economy of a man who has decided that a thing is settled. "I'll get you paper for the letter," he said, and he got up and went to find it, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the document box in front of her, and the fire crackling behind her, and the wind working at the seams of the house from outside, and she told herself quietly that it was just work. But her hands were steadier than they had been in months, and that was something she could not quite explain away as merely professional. She stayed at the table until the letter was drafted. Then she went to her room, unlaced her boots, and lay down, and this time it took her less than a minute to fall asleep. Outside, the fence line on the east side of the property lay empty and undisturbed in the dark. But not because the problem had gone away, because problems like Orrin Hale did not give up. They waited, the same way Clara had learned to wait, and they watched for the moment when the thing they wanted most looked like it was finally within reach. Whatever Hale was planning in that lawyer's office, it had already been set in motion. And Clara Whitmore, lying in the cold storeroom off the Mercer kitchen with her boots set carefully beside the cot, did not yet know how little time they had before it arrived. The letter went out on a Thursday, tucked into the weekly mail pouch that Thomas carried to Dust Hallow, along with a supply order and a payment on a credit account at the hardware store. Clara had written it in her cleanest hand, formal and precise, requesting a certified copy of the original land survey documentation filed under the Mercer claim number, which she had found on the water rights document in the box, from the Territorial Land Office in the capital. She had included a stamped return envelope and a brief explanation of the legal situation without editorializing, because she had learned that official requests received faster responses when they sounded bureaucratic rather than urgent. Whether it would come back with what they needed was another question entirely. In the meantime, there was the work. And the work, as the days accumulated, had a way of filling in around everything else. By the end of the first week, the Mercer house was not transformed. Transformation was the wrong word for what Clara was doing. She was not tearing anything down or rebuilding from scratch. She was doing something slower and more difficult. She was learning the existing system, such as it was, and finding the places where a small adjustment could change the friction, so that the same effort the brothers were already putting in started returning more than it had been. The kitchen operated on a rotation now, nothing formal. She had not posted a schedule or announced a system. She had simply, over the course of several days, moved things to where the people who used them most naturally reached and stopped restocking items in the configurations that created the most collisions, and made the coffee stronger on the mornings when she could see, from small observable signs, that the day ahead was going to be long. These things were noticed, not commented on mostly, but noticed. On the Friday evening, when the first week was technically complete, Wyatt came in from the southern pasture late, his coat dark with the particular damp of a man who has been outside in cold wind for too long, and he sat at the kitchen table and Clara set a bowl of the stew she had kept warm on the back of the stove and a cup of coffee and sat down across from him without being asked. "The week is up," she said. He looked at her over the coffee cup. "It is. Do you want to talk about the second one?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was starting to pick up. She had been noticing it all afternoon, the particular quality of the air changing, the kind of change that was not just weather, but something with intention behind it. "I want to ask you something first," he said. She waited. "Cole thinks you're here because you're running from something," he said. He said it directly, without apology for the bluntness of it, and she appreciated that more than a softer approach would have given her room to. He's not wrong that people come to places like Dust Hallow for that reason. Most of the people who ended up here because somewhere else didn't work out. Cole is not wrong that people come here for that reason, Clara said. But is he wrong about you? She looked at him. The fire in the stove was doing its work, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and the sound of the wind outside was getting serious now, moving from a sound to a presence. "I came here because I needed work and a place to be," she said. "Whether I'm running from something or towards something, I'm not sure the distinction matters much for whether I do the job well." "It matters to me," Wyatt said, "not the details. I'm not asking for details." He paused. "I'm asking whether you're going to leave in the middle of a problem." She understood then what the question actually was. It was not about her past. It was about now, about the legal situation, about the box of documents, about the letter to the territorial office, about all the threads she had picked up in 1 week that would be worse than untouched if she dropped them halfway through. "I'm not going to leave in the middle of a problem," she said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded. "Second week, then." "Second week," she said. He finished the stew and went to bed, and Clara sat in the kitchen for a while longer, listening to the wind build against the house and thinking about what the air had been telling her all afternoon, and what it was likely to mean by morning. She had grown up in a place where weather came fast and meant business, and she had learned early the difference between wind that was passing through and wind that had arrived. This wind had arrived. It had settled in with the specific patient violence of something that had decided to stay, and by the time she finally went to her room and lay down, the temperature outside had dropped enough that she could feel it through the wall. She lay in the dark and did the calculations she had been doing all evening. The cattle, the barn, the water supply, the gap in the south wall of the barn that Thomas had been meaning to patch for 3 weeks and hadn't yet managed, the hay stores which she had inventoried 2 days ago and found to be lower than they should be for this point in the season, the horses, which were stabled and would be fine, but whose water troughs would freeze solid by morning if the temperature kept dropping at this rate. She got up at 3 in the morning. She did not wake anyone immediately. She got dressed in the warmest layers she had, which were not as warm as what this night called for, but were what she had. And she went to the kitchen and built the fire up high and started heating water. And then she went to the bottom of the stairs, and she did something she had not done once in the entire first week. She raised her voice, "Wyatt!" loud enough to carry, but not a shout. "Wyatt, get up! You need to see this!" A pause. Then the sound of him moving, already awake or close to it, and his voice came back. "What is it?" "Temperature dropped hard overnight, and it's still dropping," she said. "The barn's got a gap in the south wall, and the cattle water troughs will freeze. You need your brothers up." A longer pause. Then the sound of his door opening, and then, without her having to say anything further, the sound of him moving down the hall and knocking on other doors. And within 10 minutes, the kitchen had all 6 of them in it, in various states of assembled, looking at her with the half-alert expressions of men dragged from sleep by something they haven't fully processed yet. She did not apologize for waking them. She stood at the stove and said, "The temperature overnight is going to kill your water supply if the troughs freeze. The gap in the barn's south wall will let the cold in far enough to affect the youngest cattle. I've been thinking about the layout, and I have some suggestions, but you know this ranch better than I do, so tell me where I'm wrong." Wyatt looked at her. Then he looked at Cole. Cole was already pulling on his coat. "Eli," Cole said, "go check the troughs. Thomas, bring the patching materials to the barn. You know the ones. They're by the side door." He was already moving, his sleep-roughed voice sharpening into the voice of a man with a list of things to do. "Henry, get the small heater from the tack room and set it up near the calf pen." "The heater needs fuel," Henry said. "There's a can of it in the corner by the east wall," Clara said. "I cataloged it last week. It was 3/4 full." Henry looked at her briefly, and it was not the usual watchful look. It was something more direct, the look of a person recalibrating in real time. Then everyone was moving. The next 2 hours were not orderly. They were what they were. 6 men and 1 woman fighting a hard frost in the dark, with cold hands, and the particular urgency of animals that cannot tell you they are in trouble. Clara moved between the barn and the kitchen, carrying hot water to the troughs before Eli could report back that they had already started to skin over with ice, directing where needed and staying back where not needed, and keeping the kitchen hot because there was going to be a point when everyone needed somewhere warm to come back to. The gap in the south wall of the barn was worse than Thomas had thought. He came back in at 4:30 with a cut on his palm from a piece of split wood, and the expression of a man who has discovered that what he believed was a manageable repair is something larger. "How bad?" Clara asked. "Bad enough that the patch isn't going to hold in this wind," he said. "I need to board it from the inside, but the boards I've got aren't long enough to span it properly." "What have you got in the supply shed?" she asked. "Not what I need." She thought for a moment. "There are 3 planks from the broken gate that Wyatt said was going to be rebuilt in spring. They're against the east wall of the supply shed, behind the grain bags." Thomas looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I walked every outbuilding in my first 2 days," she said. "I wanted to know what was on this property." He held her gaze for a moment, his hand wrapped in the cloth she had handed him automatically when she saw the cut, and then he said, "That might work," and went back out. She kept the kettle hot. She kept the fire steady. She made a large pot of porridge at 5 in the morning because it was what she had in quantity, and it was what a cold body needed. And when the brothers started coming in one by one, first Eli, whose ears were red from the cold, then James and Henry together, Then Cole, who came in and went straight to the stove and stood with his back to it without saying a word. She had it ready. Thomas came in last, after 6. The south wall was patched. He sat down at the table and held his coffee cup in both hands and did not speak for a full minute. Nobody spoke much. They ate, and they warmed up, and they came back into themselves. And the wind continued its assault on the outside of the house, and the morning arrived gray and locked down, the kind of morning that tells you the day has no interest in getting better. Cole looked at Clara from across the table, not with anything that could be called appreciation, exactly. That was not Cole's register, but with the particular quality of attention he gave things he had reassessed. "The trough idea," he said, "bringing the hot water before they iced over. That bought us 20 minutes. Maybe 30, Clara said. Either way, he looked at his coffee. Good thinking. It was not effusive. From Cole, it was the equivalent of a speech. Wyatt had not said anything through the meal. He sat at the head of the table and ate and watched, and Clara could see him thinking, not about the barn or the troughs or the frost, but about something larger, some accounting he was doing inside his own head that she was not privy to. After the others had dispersed back to the modified task that a frost morning demanded, he stayed at the table. "You didn't come get me first," he said. "You were the second person I woke," she said. "Behind no one. I went straight to the stairs. I mean, you didn't wait for morning and present it as a problem to solve at a reasonable hour," he said. "You made the decision that it couldn't wait, and you woke 6 men up at 3 in the morning on your 10th day here." She looked at him steadily. "Was that wrong?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "If you'd waited, it would have been worse. I'm not criticizing it." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm trying to figure out what to do with someone who walks onto a ranch on a trial week and ends up managing a weather crisis at 3 in the morning on her own initiative," he said. "Because that's not the job I posted." "No," she agreed. "But it was the job that needed doing." He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his most honest one, the one where the steadiness was not a defense but simply his nature, and where behind the steadiness he was genuinely uncertain about something and was allowing himself to be uncertain without hiding it. "Why does it feel like you've been here longer than 10 days?" he said. She didn't have an immediate answer for that. She thought about it honestly. "Because I pay attention," she said finally, "and because I'm used to places where you have to learn fast or things go wrong, so I learn fast." She paused. "That's not a gift. It's a scar from having learned the hard way why it matters." He was quiet for a moment. "The letter to the territorial office," he said. "How long do you think it'll take?" 4 to 6 weeks if they process it normally," she said. "Less if the claim number is easy to find in their records. More if there's any question about what we're asking for. And in the meantime, Hale keeps moving." "Yes," she said, "but knowing that he's moving is different from not knowing. And we have the original water rights document, which is solid. What we're trying to establish is the complete picture, not fill a gap in an otherwise empty hand." He turned his coffee cup. The habit of it was familiar to her now. He did it when he was thinking, when the thought was something he was working through rather than something he had already arrived at. "There's a man in Dust Hallow," he said slowly. "Not a lawyer, but he worked as a law clerk for several years before he came west. His name is Aldous Webb. He helps people with filings when they can't afford a proper attorney." "Has he looked at your situation before?" "No, we never asked." He set the cup down. "Pride, mostly. Not wanting to show people in town that we were struggling with it." "Would you be willing to show him the documents now?" she asked. He looked at the window. The frost had grown elaborate on the glass overnight, the kind of frost that is almost beautiful and tells you exactly how severe the night has been. "Yes," he said. "I think it's time." The storm lasted 3 days. Not the full violence of the first night, but a sustained, heavy cold that kept the temperature low and the wind active and made outdoor work a constant negotiation between what needed doing and what the weather would allow. The brothers rotated tasks to keep no one exposed for too long. The cattle were checked in pairs. The horses were kept stabled except for brief periods. The barn, with Thomas's patched wall and the small heater near the calf pen, held better than it would have. Clara kept the house. That was the simplest way to say it. She kept the house the way a good helmsman keeps a ship, not by dramatic intervention, but by continuous small adjustments, maintaining the conditions that allowed the people who needed to be outside to go outside and come back to something that functioned. She kept the stove running. She kept hot food available at irregular hours because irregular hours were what the storm imposed. She did the mending she had set aside from the pile she had found in the first week, working in the evenings by the kitchen fire, repairing the things that were repairable and setting aside the things that weren't. On the second evening of the storm, Eli came and sat across from her at the kitchen table, uninvited but not intruding. The difference was clear from how he carried himself when he sat down, the way he made himself small to take up less of the space than he was entitled to. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead," she said, without looking up from the shirt collar she was reattaching. "Where did you learn to handle a situation like last night?" he asked. "The frost. The way you thought through it before anyone else woke up." She finished the stitch she was on before she answered. "I spent several years working in a place where, if you didn't think through problems before they became emergencies, people got hurt," she said. "What kind of place?" She glanced up at him. He was 19 and his face had the quality of genuine curiosity without the sharper edge of interrogation. He was asking because he wanted to know, not because he was testing her or pushing at the edges of what she would share. "A large household," she said. "Well, I managed it, east of here, before things changed." She paused. "The family that owned it had a situation that became complicated, and when it did, I was the one responsible for keeping the parts of the operation that could keep going still running, under pressure, for a long time." "What happened to the family?" he asked. She went back to the caller. "They lost the property," she said. "In the end, through circumstances I couldn't prevent." She paused. "I stayed until the last day and made sure everything that could be saved was saved. Then I left." Eli was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Is that why you came here?" he said. "Because you know what it looks like when a property starts to slip and you wanted to do something about it before it gets that far?" She looked at him again. He was smarter than he got credit for. She had noticed this, the way the brothers' dynamics placed him as the youngest and therefore somewhat discounted, and how he worked around that discount with a particular quality of observation that had nothing to do with age. "That's part of it," she said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad you're here," he said. It came out straightforward, without ornament, the way honest things come out when the person saying them has not yet learned to be self-conscious about them. She set the mended shirt aside and looked at him directly. "Thank you, Eli." He got up and got himself water and went back to wherever he had been. And the kitchen was quiet again, except for the fire and the wind, and Clara started on the next item in the mending pile, and the evening went on. On the third day of the storm, Henry came to her. Not in the kitchen. He came to the door of her storeroom in the early afternoon, which was unusual enough. Nobody had come to that door since she had taken the room, that she knew before he spoke that it was something he had decided to do deliberately. "I wanted to show you something," he said. He had a ledger under his arm. The accounts ledger, she recognized the binding from seeing it on his desk when she had walked past the room he used for accounting work. She stepped back from the door to let him in. He came in and looked around the storeroom briefly, not intrusively, but with the noticing quality that all the Mercer brothers had in their own ways. And then he sat on the single wooden chair she had moved in from the kitchen last week, and he set the ledger on his knee, and he opened it. "I've been keeping these for 3 years," he said, "since my mother died. She did it before that." She sat on the edge of the cot and waited. "I'm not an accountant," he said. "I know what I'm doing isn't... I know it has problems. I know that some of the way I've organized it doesn't make it easy to see things clearly." He opened to a page somewhere in the middle and turned the ledger to face her. "Wyatt told me about the documents, about Hale, and I was thinking that if you can look at the land papers and find what's missing, maybe you could look at this and tell me if there's something I'm not seeing." She took the ledger and looked at the page he had opened to. His handwriting was nothing like hers. It was larger and less consistent, the writing of a man who had taught himself from necessity rather than instruction. But it was readable, and the logic behind the system, once she started tracing it, was visible even where it was imperfect. How much does Wyatt know about the financial situation? She asked. Henry's pause told her something. He knows the general picture, Henry said. He knows it's been tight. He doesn't know some of the specifics. What specifics? Henry looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back at her. We had a loan, he said, from the Dust Hallow bank, 18 months ago when the spring was bad and we needed supplies and we'd already spent everything we had on the legal situation. He paused. The terms are not… I thought at the time they were reasonable. I've come to think I didn't understand them as well as I should have. What are the terms? She asked. He told her. She listened without interrupting. The terms were not the worst she had heard, but they were not what a fair lender offered a family already under pressure. They were the terms of someone who saw an opportunity and used it. The interest rate stepped up after 18 months, which was now approaching, and the rate it stepped up to was high enough that the monthly payment would nearly double. Does Wyatt know the rate steps up? She asked. I told him there was a rate adjustment coming, Henry said. I didn't tell him how much. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. The wind pressed against the small north window of the storeroom and the glass shivered in its frame. Because he was already carrying so much, Henry said, and because I thought by now I would have figured out a way to manage it. He looked at the ledger in her hands. I haven't. Clara looked at the relevant pages. She did the arithmetic in her head. It was not complicated arithmetic, just the arithmetic of numbers that did not add up to what was needed, which is the most crushing kind because there is nothing wrong with the calculation. The double payment date, she said. When exactly? 6 weeks, Henry said. She thought about the territorial office letter, also 6 weeks out. She thought about Hale, moving through his lawyer and his county recorder connections. She thought about the storm outside, which would cost them days of productive work and possibly some livestock if the cold held. She thought about the household she had managed east of here, and the moment she had realized too late that several things were wrong simultaneously and that the time to address them had passed without her seeing it. All right, she said. She set the ledger on the cot beside her and looked at him directly. You need to tell Wyatt the full picture. Not because I'm going to tell him if you don't. I won't. It's not my place. But because you're going to need his input to figure out how to handle this, and you can't get useful input from someone who doesn't have the full information. Henry looked at the ledger. He's going to be angry. Probably, she said, for a little while. He'll be angrier in 6 weeks if he finds out then, instead of now. Henry was quiet for a long moment. He had the quality, in that moment, of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just been asked to set it down in front of another person, and the effort of it was visible in the way he held himself. Would you be there, he said, when I tell him? Not for anything other than, I don't know. He stopped. Wyatt responds to things differently when there's someone else in the room who isn't one of us. It makes him more careful about what he says. She understood what he was asking. It was not a small thing. Yes, she said. If that's what you need, yes. Henry picked up the ledger and stood. He looked at her with the look he gave to things he had taken time to assess. My mother would have liked you, he said. It came out quietly, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation that he was letting her have the way you share something that has some value without making a production of the sharing. She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing, and he left, and the door closed behind him, and the storeroom was quiet, with just the cold and the wind and the small fire of information that was now sitting in her mind alongside everything else. 6 weeks, on 2 separate fronts, one with a potential document that might or might not exist in a territorial office, one with a loan payment that was going to hit like a stone wall regardless of what any office produced. Clara sat on the cot in the storeroom and looked at the north window and let herself feel the full weight of what she was inside, for the first time since she had arrived. Not the job she had been hired for, not the trial week that had become a second week, the actual situation, the shape of it, the difficulty of it, the specific combination of pressures that were all pointing toward the same narrow window of time. She had been in situations with narrow windows before. She knew what it felt like. She also knew something that the Mercer brothers, each carrying his portion of the problem alone, did not yet know about their combined situation. Separate problems were hard, but separate problems, once you could see them together, sometimes had solutions that connected. One thread, pulled from the right angle, could loosen more than one knot. She just had to find the right angle. She got up and went back to the kitchen and stoked the fire and started thinking. And outside, the storm continued its conversation with the house, and the house, patched and tended and kept, held. The storm broke on the fourth day. Not gently. The weather in that part of the country did not do gentle endings. It broke the way it had arrived, with a kind of blunt finality, the wind dropping off in the early morning hours, and the temperature lifting just enough that the ice on the water troughs softened at the edges, and the sky came back from white to the flat gray that passed for normal in February. The Mercer brothers went back to their full work schedules with the particular focused energy of men who have been partially confined and are ready to move. And the ranch absorbed the storm's damage the way it absorbed everything, by requiring more work than it gave back, immediately and without sentiment. Clara let 2 days pass after the storm before she said anything to Henry about the conversation with Wyatt. She used those 2 days well. She went through Henry's ledger again, this time more slowly, with a piece of paper beside her on which she made her own parallel record, not rewriting his system, but translating it into a form where the key numbers were visible without having to trace through his particular logic to find them. She identified the specific months where the ranch income had been strongest, and the specific expenditures that were largest and most consistent, and the place in the loan structure where the stepped rate would apply, and what the actual number would be. The number was not as catastrophic as she had feared, and that was the useful thing she found. It was serious. It was a real problem. But it was not the kind of number that meant the end of everything if it was addressed directly and early, which was different from the picture she had been afraid might emerge when she had sat with Henry in the storeroom, listening to him describe it. She brought this information to Henry on a Tuesday morning, when the others were well established in their outdoor work and the kitchen was quiet. "I went through the ledger again," she said. He looked up from the coffee he had been staring into. "And?" She set her parallel record on the table and walked him through it. She did not soften it, and she did not dramatize it. She showed him where the numbers were and what they meant and where the potential solutions were, because there were potential solutions. 2 of them, neither one easy, but both real. The first was to approach the bank about renegotiating the step-up terms before the deadline arrived. Banks in small frontier towns were not known for generosity, but they were also not always irrational. A renegotiated loan at a lower step-up rate, secured by the ranch's improved operational picture, was sometimes preferable to a borrower who defaulted because the terms became unmanageable. It depended on the banker. The second was to identify whether any portion of the upcoming season's cattle sale could be advanced, either through an early sale of some portion of the herd or through a forward arrangement with a buyer who wanted to commit to a purchase price, now in exchange for delivery later. "Neither of those is a simple fix," Henry said. "No," Clara agreed, "but they're real options. They require action now, not in 6 weeks." He looked at the numbers on her paper. He looked at them for a long time. "I should have seen this," he said. Not to her exactly, to himself or to the situation. "I've been looking at these numbers for 3 years, and I should have seen that there was a path through it." "You were too close to it," she said, "and you were carrying it alone." He looked up at her. "I need to tell Wyatt today," he said. "Yes," she said. "You do. Tonight, after dinner, when the others are settled." "I'll be there," she said. She was. The conversation happened at the kitchen table at 7:30, with the dishes cleared and the fire in the stove built up against the night cold that had returned after the storm's departure, as though the weather had simply taken a brief pause. Wyatt sat at the head of the table. Henry sat to his left. Clara sat at the far end, present but not central. There, at Henry's request, as she had agreed, positioned to be in the room without making it her room. Henry told him. He told him all of it. The loan terms, the step-up rate, the 6-week timeline, and the fact that he had not shared the full picture before because he had believed he could manage it and had been wrong about that belief. Wyatt listened without interrupting. His face did what it did when he was taking in something difficult. It went very still, not cold, but controlled, the stillness of a man who knows that what he does with his face in the next few minutes will affect what happens after them. When Henry finished, Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. How long have you known the full figure? He said. 4 months, Henry said. Another silence. Clara watched Wyatt's hands on the table, flat, not gripping, but with a tension across the knuckles that told her what the stillness was costing him. All right, Wyatt said. Henry blinked. What would you like me to say? Wyatt said, and there was an edge in it, not enough to be called anger, but the sound of something controlled that was not entirely comfortable being controlled. You should have told me sooner. I think you know that. Telling you now doesn't change the numbers. I know, Henry said. Clara has looked at it, Wyatt said. It was not a question. He had clearly noticed what was on the table in front of her. Yes, she said. I can walk you through what I found. Tomorrow morning, he said. Early, before the others are up. He stood. He looked at Henry for a moment with the expression of a man filing something away for later, something he would come back to when the immediate problem was handled. Thank you for telling me. He left the kitchen. They heard his boots on the stairs, and then the sound of his door, closed but not slammed. Henry sat at the table and let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding for 4 months. That was better than I expected, he said quietly. He's a reasonable man, Clara said. He was angry. He'll be less angry tomorrow. Henry looked at her. How do you know? Because the anger was about not knowing, she said. Once he's had the night to work with the information, the anger becomes less useful to him than solving the problem. Henry looked at the table. Then he said, unexpectedly, You know a lot about how people handle things. I've been in rooms where it mattered, she said. She began gathering her papers. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long conversation. She was right about that. Wyatt came down at 5 the next morning, before even the stove was lit, and he sat at the kitchen table in his coat because the kitchen was cold, and he waited. And when Clara came in 15 minutes later and found him there, she simply went to the stove and started the fire, and said nothing until the coffee was made. Then she sat down across from him and put her papers between them, and they worked. 2 hours. The house woke up around them, the brothers coming down one by one and reading the room with varying degrees of accuracy. Cole stopped in the doorway and looked at the papers spread across the table, and at Wyatt's face, and turned and went back upstairs and came down later, which was the most tactful thing Clara had seen Cole do. And by the time the full morning had established itself, Wyatt understood the numbers, understood the options, and had made a decision. The bank first, he said. I'll go to Dust Hallow today and speak to Garrett. Take the ledger, Clara said, and take my parallel summary. The summary shows the income trajectory more clearly than the ledger does on its own. Will Garrett respond to that? He'll respond to seeing that someone has looked at the numbers carefully, she said. Bankers are not always unsympathetic to people who demonstrate they understand their own situation. What they don't like is being surprised by people who don't. I'll take Cole, Wyatt said. Cole settles me when I'm... He paused. When I need settling. She noted this without comment. It was the most personal thing he had said to her that was not directly related to the situation, and she recognized it as such. He and Cole left for town at 8:30. Clara watched the wagon until it disappeared and then went back to the kitchen and started the work of the day. And the hours moved with the particular slow wait of hours spent waiting for news. The letter from the territorial office arrived on that same afternoon. Thomas brought it in from the mail run. He had gone to Dust Hallow separately for hardware supplies and collected the mail, and he set it on the kitchen table with the particular care of someone who understood what envelope it was. Clara looked at it. The Territorial Land Office return address was in the upper left corner, clear and official. She did not open it. She set it in the center of the table and left it for Wyatt. He came back from town at 4 o'clock with Cole, and with an expression that was not triumphant but was not defeated either. The expression of a man who has had a difficult conversation that went better than expected but has left him tired in a specific way. He saw the envelope immediately. He sat down. He picked it up. He looked at the return address and then at Clara. Open it, she said. He opened it. The Territorial Land Office had found the survey documentation. All of it. The complete original filing, including the creek boundary section that had been missing from the box in the upstairs room. The letter confirmed that certified copies were enclosed and that the originals remained on file with the Territorial Office, accessible to any legal proceeding that required them. Wyatt read the letter twice. Then he set it down and looked at the copies inside. 3 pages of survey documentation in the careful hand of a territorial surveyor from 26 years ago, with the creek boundary marked clearly and the Mercer claim line running exactly where the Mercers had always said it ran, and Orrin Hale's land running exactly where it always had, and the water running through land that was not and had never been Hale's. Cole, who had been reading over Wyatt's shoulder, straightened up and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's it." "That's it," Wyatt said. "He can't argue against a certified copy from the Territorial Office," Cole said. "Not with Pendleton, not with anyone." "He can try," Clara said, "but he'll lose. The document is independent of anything the county recorder's office holds, and it's been in the Territorial Archive for 26 years untouched." She paused. "You need to take this to Aldous Webb immediately. Today, if possible. He needs to file notice with the county court that you have the complete documentation, and he needs to do it before Hale's lawyer files whatever Hale's lawyer has been preparing." Wyatt looked at her. "Webb closes at 5. "It's 4:15, she said. He was already standing. "Cole." "I'm coming," Cole said, already at the door. They went. They made it to Webb's office with 12 minutes to spare, and Aldous Webb, a small, careful man with wire-rimmed glasses and the compressed energy of someone who has learned to do a great deal in limited space, read the documents, read Clara's covering summary that Wyatt had thought to bring, and filed the counter notice to the county court before 5 o'clock with the satisfied efficiency of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of case to land on his desk. The counter notice was on record before Pendleton could file whatever Hale had paid him to prepare. The brothers came back to the ranch at dusk. All 6 of them were in the kitchen that evening, which was not unusual anymore, had become less unusual with each passing week. And the dinner Clara had made was on the table, and they ate. And then something happened that had not happened in that kitchen in a long time. They stayed. Not for any announced reason, not because anyone organized it. They stayed because the table had food, and the fire was good, and the news from that afternoon was sitting in the room like something that needed to be shared without the formality of being presented, and staying felt like the right thing. James talked about the fence work he and Eli had started on the south boundary. Eli, emboldened by something, the evening or the week, or the accumulated weight of things going better, described a problem he had solved in the barn using a method he had figured out on his own. And Thomas listened and asked a question about it that took the conversation somewhere genuinely interesting. Henry said something that made Cole laugh, which was rare enough that everyone noticed it, though nobody commented. Wyatt sat at the head of the table and let it happen. Clara was at the stove refilling the coffee with her back to the table, and she listened to the sound of it. 6 men talking to each other the way people talk when they have stopped managing their interactions and started simply having them. And she felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time. She stood very still for a moment with the coffee pot in her hand. Then she turned and went back to the table and refilled cups without comment and sat down in her chair at the far end, and the conversation flowed around her and sometimes included her and sometimes didn't, and both were fine. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Wyatt stayed. He did what he did. He sat with his coffee going cold and the fire settling behind him, and something on his mind that was finding its way toward words. Clara waited. She had learned his pace. "The bank," he said. "Garrett agreed to renegotiate the step-up rate. Not all the way down, not as low as I wanted, but low enough that we can manage it without gutting the spring budget." "That's good," she said. "He said—" Wyatt paused. He turned the cup. "He said the summary you made was the clearest picture of our financials he'd seen in 3 years of our account with them." He looked at her. "He asked if we'd hired an accountant." She said nothing. "I told him we had someone helping with the household," he said. He seemed to find that funny for some reason. "Bankers have a limited sense of humor," she said. He almost smiled. The shape of it was there, same as it had always been, close to the surface, not quite landing. "What happened to you, Clara?" he said. Not aggressively, not with the pressing quality of someone demanding an answer, with the quiet directness of a man who has been patient because he has understood that patience is what the situation called for, and who is now asking because the moment has arrived when it is possible to ask. She looked at him for a long moment. "I told Eli I managed a large household east of here," she said. "That's true. It was a substantial property. Not a ranch, a different kind of operation. The family that owned it had legal troubles that started small and became large, and I stayed through all of it because I believed the situation could be saved, and I was wrong." She paused. "When it ended, there was a period where I was involved in the legal proceedings related to the estate. My name was associated with the situation in ways that were complicated. Not because I had done anything wrong, because I had been present and visible when things went wrong. And in those circumstances, visible people become part of the story, whether the story is accurate or not." Wyatt was listening with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. "I left because staying became impossible," she said. "Not because I was guilty of anything, because the version of me that existed in that place was already decided for people, and you cannot work effectively in a place where you have already been decided." She paused. "I came west because west was where there was still enough space that a person could be what they actually were instead of what the last place had decided they were." She said it as plainly as she could. She did not make it into a performance or a plea. It was what it was. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "The sheriff grabbing your arm on the main street," he said. "First day." "Yes," she said. "That's the version of me that travels ahead." He looked at the table. He looked at the document box, which had migrated from the upstairs room to the kitchen shelf in the past 2 weeks, because it was being used now and needed to be accessible. "Not here," he said. "Not on this ranch." It was not a promise exactly. It was a statement of what he had decided. There was a difference, and she knew the difference. "I know," she said. He stood up. He picked up his cup and took it to the counter and set it down. "There's one more thing," he said. He did not turn around immediately. He was looking at the window, at the darkness outside, at some point in the middle distance that was not quite the glass and not quite what was beyond it. Hale is not going to accept this quietly. The counter notice stops him legally for now. It does not stop him as a person. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." "He has more ways to make things difficult than through the courts," Wyatt said. "He's done it before. The fence posts last spring. Things that are hard to prove but easy to do." "I know," she said. "I want you to know that if things become more difficult, not just paperwork difficult, but present and physical difficult, I'm not going to ask you to handle that alone." He turned then and looked at her. "You've been carrying pieces of this by yourself. That's not how things work here. Not anymore." She looked at him. The fire in the stove was burning low, and the kitchen was getting cooler at the edges, and the house around them was quiet with the particular settled quiet of people sleeping, and outside the land lay in its vast, indifferent dark. She did not know how to receive what he had just said without immediately qualifying it or deflecting it. She was aware of this as a failure of a specific kind, the kind you develop when you have been in enough situations where trust was offered and then rescinded, and the body learns to hedge before the mind has decided to. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was true, and because he deserved the truth, "I'm not used to that." "I know," he said. "I've noticed." He went to bed. Clara stayed in the kitchen a while longer. She thought about the document box on the shelf, about the certified survey copies now in Aldous Webb's filing cabinet with a county court notice attached, about the renegotiated loan rate and Henry's ledger and the clean parallel summary she had made, about Edna Pruitt and her ears and her 20 years of friendship with a woman she would never have the chance to speak to again. She thought about Orrin Hale, somewhere on his property in the dark, learning, because people like Hale always learned these things quickly, that the counter notice had been filed. Wyatt was right. Legal defeat was not the same as human defeat for a man like Hale. It would make him more careful, not less motivated. The water rights were secure now, on paper. But paper was a different substance from the actual land, and the actual land was still out there every morning, with its fence lines and its creek and its boundaries that a man with bad intentions could still test in ways that were hard to document. She would need to think about that. She had some ideas already: the fence line monitoring, the documentation practices that could be put in place for any future boundary incidents, the relationship with Edna and her network of useful information. These things could be built into the ordinary operation of the ranch without making it feel like a defensive posture, because the best defense she had ever seen was the kind that looked like good management. But that was tomorrow's thinking. Tonight she was sitting in a kitchen that was warm because she had kept it warm, in a house that was functioning because she had helped it function, in a place where 6 men had sat around a table after dinner and talked to each other the way families talk when they remember how. She reached down and unlaced her boots. Not part way. All the way. She pulled them off and set them beside the chair and sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen in her stocking feet. And the floor was cold through the wool, but it was the floor of somewhere, not the floor of anywhere. And that distinction had weight. She set the boots by the stove to warm and went to her room and went to bed without them for the first time since she had arrived. Outside, somewhere along the eastern fence line, the dry trees stood in the dark without anyone watching from them. For now, Orrin Hale made his next move on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the counter notice was filed. He did not come himself. That was not how men like Hale operated. They did not show up in person for the things they could not later deny. Instead, 2 men Clara had never seen arrived at the Mercer ranch on horseback at 9:30, when Wyatt and Cole were in the south pasture, and Thomas was in the barn, and the 3 younger brothers were out on the eastern fence line, doing the monitoring rotation she had quietly built into the weekly schedule over the past month. The 2 men tied their horses at the post and walked to the front door and knocked. Clara answered it. They were not threatening in any obvious way. That was the careful part of it. They were polite, even, hats in hand, voices measured, the posture of men who have been told to be correct and are being correct. One of them said he was there to conduct a survey on behalf of a property interest adjacent to the Mercer claim, and that they had authorization to walk the eastern boundary line. Authorization from whom? Clara asked. The man produced a paper. She took it and read it. It was a court order, or something dressed to look like one, signed by a judge she did not recognize, in a county she was not certain had jurisdiction over this land. She read it twice. Then she looked at the man. "Wait here," she said, and closed the door. She went to the kitchen shelf where the document box was kept and pulled out the folder she had assembled over the past 3 weeks. Not just the original documents, but a working reference set she had organized specifically so that any claim or counterclaim could be checked against the Mercer records immediately without having to search. She found what she was looking for in under a minute: the jurisdictional boundary documentation that placed the Mercer property firmly in one county, not the county named in the paper the men had just handed her. She went back to the door. "The court order you've presented is from the wrong county," she said. "This property falls under a different jurisdiction. A judge from that county has no authority to order a survey here." The man looked at her with the careful expression of someone who had not expected this response from whoever answered the door. "Ma'am, this is a legal document. It's a legal document from the wrong jurisdiction," she said. "You're welcome to verify that with Aldous Webb in Dust Hallow, who has the complete filing on this property. His office is on the east end of Main Street." She held the paper back out to him. "I'd also suggest you inform whoever sent you that the territorial survey documentation for this claim was certified and filed with the county court 4 weeks ago. Any boundary survey conducted without the Mercer family's consent and without proper jurisdictional authority will be documented and submitted as evidence of continued harassment." She said it the way she said most things, without drama, without heat, as though she were describing something as straightforward as the weather. The man took his paper back. He looked at his companion. His companion gave him nothing useful. "We'll be in contact," the man said. "That's fine," Clara said. "Contact Aldous Webb." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the latch, breathing slowly, waiting for the sound of their horses leaving. The sound came within a minute. She listened until it faded. Then she went to the kitchen and wrote down everything. The time, the names as best she had caught them, the description of the paper, the jurisdictional error, what she had said, what they had said. She wrote it in her clear, angular hand on a fresh page in the documentation folder and dated it and initialed it. When Wyatt came in for lunch, she told him. He read what she had written. He read it with the stillness he brought to things that required him to control his response, and when he finished, he set the paper down with a care that was more deliberate than it needed to be for a piece of paper. "He's pushing to see what we do," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said, "and now he knows. That we'll document it. That we'll document it and respond correctly, and that someone here knows the difference between a valid court order and a piece of paper designed to look like one." She sat down across from him. "He'll try something else, but it'll take him time to regroup, and time is what we need right now." Wyatt looked at her. "Where did you learn to read a jurisdictional boundary question that fast?" She had been waiting for this question, or one like it, for several weeks. She had been deciding, over those weeks, what the honest answer was. "I told you I was involved in legal proceedings after the household I managed collapsed," she said. "What I didn't tell you is that I was involved in them for almost 2 years. I was a material witness in a property dispute that was more complicated than this one, and I spent 2 years reading every document that came across the table because nobody else was going to do it and because the outcome mattered to people I cared about." She paused. "I lost that case, but I learned a great deal in the losing." Wyatt was quiet. "The outcome here is not going to be the same," she said. "You have the documentation. You have Webb. You have time, which we used correctly. Hale doesn't have a case anymore. He has frustration and he has money to spend on harassment, but that's a different thing from a case." "How long before he accepts that?" Wyatt said. "That depends on how much the frustration costs him," she said. "Men like Hale don't quit because they're wrong. They quit because continuing becomes more expensive than stopping." He thought about this. "So we make it expensive." "We make it documented," she said. "Every incident, every paper, every unauthorized person on or near this property. We build a record, and at some point the record itself becomes the argument." She paused. "Webb can advise on when the record is sufficient to file a harassment claim. At that point, Hale starts spending money defending instead of attacking." It was not a fast solution. It was not satisfying in the way that direct confrontation would have been satisfying. She knew this, and she knew the brothers felt the friction of it, particularly Cole, who had the disposition of a man built for direct confrontation and found the legal patience of the situation like wearing boots 2 sizes too small. But it was what would work, and over the following weeks it did. Spring came to the Mercer ranch the way spring came to that part of the country. Not as a relief, but as a replacement of one set of demands with another set, the cold giving way to the mud giving way to the first real growth of the season, and with it all the work that the land required when it woke up. The cattle were in better condition than they had been the previous spring, partly because of the barn repairs and partly because of the supply organization that had ensured the winter feed was managed more carefully than it had been in the years since Margaret Mercer died. Clara noticed this in the way she noticed most things, not in a moment of declaration, but in the accumulation of evidence. She was in the barn one morning in late March, watching Thomas assess the herd's condition, and she heard him say to Cole quietly, not for her benefit, "They came through better than last year." Cole had said nothing, but the silence he gave it was the silence of agreement, small things, the kind of things that don't make a story unless you know what they replaced. The documentation record grew through March and into April. 2 more incidents. A Mercer fence post found cut on the south boundary, a report from Edna Pruitt that one of Hale's hands had been making inquiries in town about the Mercer water usage. Both documented. Both submitted to Webb. Both added to the file that was building itself into something that Aldous Webb, in a meeting with Wyatt and Clara in his small office in late April, described as approaching actionable. "Approaching," Clara said. "One more incident of this quality, and we file," Webb said. He was a man who used words with precision, which she respected. "At that point, we're not just defending your claim. We're on offense." Wyatt looked at her on the walk back to the wagon. "One more incident," he said. "He'll provide it," she said. "He can't help himself." She was right, and she took no satisfaction in being right. The final incident came in the second week of May. Not a fence post or an unauthorized survey. Something more direct. Hale himself appeared at the edge of the Mercer property, at the creek boundary, with 2 hands and a wagon carrying what appeared to be equipment for diverting a water flow. Cole saw it first. He came back to the house at a gallop and came through the door and said 3 words. Hale. The creek. What happened next was not a confrontation in the violent sense, though Clara had prepared for the possibility that it might become one, which was why she had spoken to Wyatt about it the week before, specifically about what the appropriate response was and what it was not. Wyatt and Cole and Thomas rode out to the creek boundary. Clara stayed at the house with the documentation folder and Aldous Webb's office address written on the top of it, and Eli rode to town to bring Webb the moment she told him to go. She told him to go when the brothers left. At the creek, what actually happened was this. Wyatt told Hale he was standing on Mercer land at a Mercer water source with equipment that constituted an attempted diversion, and that there was a witness present, Thomas, and that the incident was being documented, and that the moment Hale moved his equipment another foot, he would be in violation of a court-recognized water rights claim that had been filed and certified and was held in the territorial office. Hale stood there. He was a large man, Clara had heard, with the build of someone who had done physical work for most of his life and had never fully left it behind even after he had the money to stop. He stood there and he looked at Wyatt. And he looked at the paperwork Wyatt had brought. She had put together a laminated summary card specifically for this kind of moment, the key facts of the Mercer claim in clear language that could be read in a minute. And he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "This isn't over." "It is at this creek," Wyatt said. Hale took his men and his wagon and he left. Aldous Webb filed the harassment claim that afternoon, with Eli present as the witness who had ridden to town and could testify to the timeline. The claim named 3 incidents specifically and referenced the documented record of 5 others. Webb sent copies to the county court, to the territorial office, and, on Clara's suggestion, to the regional newspaper in the nearest large town, framed as a notice of legal action that was a matter of public record. The newspaper was the thing that mattered most, as it turned out. Not immediately. Nothing worked immediately, and anyone who told you it did was selling something. But within 3 weeks of the notice appearing in print, 2 other landowners in the county came forward to say they had experienced similar boundary pressure from Hale and had documentation of their own. 3 claims in the same county with documented evidence naming the same party. That was a different kind of problem for Orrin Hale than one family's dispute. His lawyer Pendleton withdrew from the water rights case in early June. The county court dismissed Hale's remaining filing for lack of substantive evidence. The harassment claim was resolved through a legal settlement that required Hale to pay a sum. Clara thought was too modest, and Webb thought was realistic, and Wyatt accepted because it was money, and they needed money, and accepting it meant the thing was done. It was done. Not dramatically, not with the feeling of a door slamming, more like a door that has been swinging in a draft, finally settling into its frame. A small click, and then stillness where there had been movement for a long time. Clara sat with the settlement document for a while after it came. She sat with it the way she sat with things that had required sustained effort to achieve, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but settling into the new shape of things, the shape where this particular fight was finished. She thought about the household east of here, the one she had managed for years and watched fail in the end despite everything she had done. She had never let herself draw a direct line between that loss and this situation, because the situations were different and the people were different, and drawing that line would have been a way of making this story about her rather than about the Mercers, and it was not her story. But she was human enough to notice, sitting with the settlement document in the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch in June, that it had ended differently, that the things she had learned in the losing had been put to use in a place where they mattered. That was not nothing. That was in fact a great deal. Wyatt came in and found her at the table and sat down across from her, and he looked at the settlement document and then at her, and he said, "It's done." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his most serious, the one where he was not managing what he showed, just looking. "Stay," he said. Not as a question, not as a proposal of anything other than what the word contained. The simple request of a man who has arrived at a clear preference and has decided the moment is right to say it plainly. She looked at him. "This job isn't what it was when I arrived," she said. "No," he agreed. "I'm doing work now that has nothing to do with what you put on the card at the Threadneedle." "I know." "If I stay—" She paused. She was being careful, not because she was uncertain about her own preference, but because she had learned more than once that agreements made without clarity became resentments later. "If I stay, the terms need to be honest. I'm not a housekeeper who does legal paperwork on the side. I don't know exactly what I am in terms of what you'd call the role." "Neither do I," Wyatt said. "But I know what the ranch looks like now compared to 6 months ago, and I know which part of that is you, and I know that losing it would be a loss I don't want to absorb." He said it without ornamentation, the way he said things that were true and difficult. "I'll stay," she said. She said it simply, the way she said most things. But she felt it in a way she had not felt anything in a very long time, down into the place where the decision actually lived, not the surface of it, but the root. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that does not announce itself as significant while it is happening. It was work. It was the ordinary, demanding, unglamorous work of a ranch in the growing season. Cattle and fencing and water management and supply runs and the constant negotiation with weather and land that is the basic condition of a life built on this kind of ground. Clara was part of it in all the ways she had become part of it, and in some new ways that emerged as the months moved. Henry's accounts became a genuine working system, built together over a series of Tuesday mornings at the kitchen table, with Clara translating his organic understanding of the finances into a structure that could be read and used and handed off if it ever needed to be. Henry was not a natural accountant, he never would be, but he was intelligent and diligent, and with a decent system under him, he was more than adequate. The ledger that had been a source of private shame became something he showed Wyatt without hesitation. Cole never fully relaxed around her. She accepted this. Cole was a man who gave his trust in very small increments and took a long time about it, and she was not entitled to be the exception to that. But the active resistance of the early weeks had resolved into something she would call a working respect. He disagreed with her sometimes, directly and without much softening, and she disagreed back the same way, and they did not always reach the same conclusion, and the world did not end because of any of it. That was its own kind of progress. Thomas fixed things. That was what Thomas did and what he continued to do, and the thing that changed was that he occasionally came to her before beginning a repair to ask whether there was a supply implication she was aware of, because 3 times now she had known about a material shortage before it became a problem, and it had saved him a second trip to town. This small coordination was not a transformation. It was just 2 people who worked in the same place learning the edges of each other's knowledge and making use of the overlap. Eli grew. Not dramatically. Growth in people is rarely dramatic, except in retrospect. But he was less careful at the kitchen table by June, more willing to say the thing he was thinking before he had checked it 3 times, and that quality of unguardedness made the evenings livelier in a way that the other brothers seemed to appreciate, even when they wouldn't have said so. James remained quiet and worked well, and seemed, more than anyone else, to simply accept the new shape of things without requiring it to be discussed. And the house itself. The house was different, not renovated, not transformed. The storeroom off the kitchen was still the storeroom off the kitchen, and Clara still slept in it, and it was still cold before dawn and the window still faced north and let in the gray morning light. But it had a proper bed frame now, with a mattress, because Thomas had found the frame in the supply shed in early spring and repaired it without being asked, and set it up without announcing what he was doing, and she had come back one afternoon to find it there. She had stood in the doorway of her room for a moment looking at it. Then she had gone back to the kitchen and made dinner and said nothing, and Thomas had said nothing, and the transaction was complete. In September, Edna Pruitt came out to the ranch for the first time. Clara had invited her, the first time she had invited anyone to the property, and she had done it through a letter carried by the weekly mail run, formal enough to signal that she meant it as a real invitation, and not a casual mention. Edna arrived in her own wagon, which she drove herself, and she climbed down with the contained efficiency of a woman who has never needed assistance and has not started needing it now. She looked at the house. She looked at the barn. She looked at the kitchen garden Clara had put in along the south-facing wall of the house in the spring. Nothing elaborate, practical vegetables in practical rows, but alive and producing. "Margaret would be pleased," Edna said. It was not a small thing to say. Clara received it as what it was. They had lunch at the kitchen table, the two of them, while the brothers were at their work, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about the legal situation, which was finished, about the town, about the county, about the network of information that Edna maintained with the systematic care of someone who understood that in an isolated place, knowledge of what was happening was a form of safety, about what Clara had found when she arrived and what it looked like now. "You built something here," Edna said near the end of the afternoon. "The Mercers built this," Clara said. "I helped with some of the problems." Edna looked at her with the direct, unvarnished look she used when she thought something was being understated to the point of inaccuracy. "A house where people don't talk to each other is not a home," Edna said. "You know that. A ranch that can't defend its own claim is not a going concern. You fixed both of those things. The Mercers did the work, yes, but you're the one who saw what needed doing and did it without waiting to be asked. And in my experience, that's the rare quality." Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the September afternoon was warm and still, and through the kitchen window she could see the edge of the kitchen garden, and beyond it the open land, and somewhere out there the sound of cattle and the distant voice of Eli calling something to James. "I needed this as much as they did," Clara said. It was honest enough to be uncomfortable, which meant it was worth saying. "I came here with nothing, and a history that made me smaller than I was, and this place gave me room. The work gave me room." She paused. "You don't fix things without getting something back from the fixing. That's not generosity. That's just how it works." Edna considered this. "Maybe," she said. "But most people, when they need something, take it. They don't also leave the place better than they found it." Clara had no answer for that. She poured more coffee and let the afternoon sit the way good afternoons should sit, without needing to be filled. Wyatt came in as Edna was preparing to leave, and he shook Edna's hand and they exchanged the brief, charged words of people who share a past that neither of them will reference directly, and then Edna climbed back into her wagon and drove away toward Dust Hallow, and Wyatt stood in the yard watching until she turned onto the main road. He came back inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the table, at the 2 cups, at the afternoon sitting in the room the way it did when something had been resolved. "She hasn't been out here since my mother died," he said. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her. "Thank you for inviting her." She did not say it was nothing, because it wasn't, and she had stopped saying things were nothing when they were something. "She loved your mother," Clara said. "She needed to see that the place was all right." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed, not closed off, just settled, the posture of a man who is in a place where he can let his weight down. "Is it?" he said. "All right?" It was not a simple question, and they both knew it. Clara looked at the kitchen, at the organized shelves and the strong fire, and the mended curtain on the window and the document box on its shelf, and the coffee cups that had sat across from each other while 2 women talked for 2 hours about a county's worth of living. She looked at all of it. "It's not finished," she said. "It's not going to be finished. There'll be another hard winter and another problem with the accounts, and probably another person who decides the boundary line is negotiable." She looked at him. "But the bones of it are good, and the people in it are talking to each other, and that's... yes, it's all right." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once with the finality he gave to things he had decided were true. He went to wash up for dinner. Clara turned back to the stove. The thing about belonging somewhere is that it doesn't arrive in a moment you can point to afterward and say, "There. That was it. That was the day it changed." It arrives in the accumulated weight of small, ordinary things, the way a particular floor creaks under your foot in the dark, and you know where to step to avoid it, the way the stove runs hot on the left side and you adjust for it without thinking, the way the sound of the house at night becomes a language you can read. Clara had spent a long time sleeping in her boots, ready to run. She had spent a long time in places where belonging was conditional, where the terms of her presence were always subject to revision by someone else, where the version of herself that existed in a place was the version that place had decided to accept rather than the version she actually was. Here, in this kitchen, in this house, on this particular piece of difficult and unromantic frontier land, she was what she actually was. Not perfectly. Not without friction or difficulty or the ordinary misunderstandings of people living and working in close proximity to each other, but actually. That was what she had walked toward when she left the East. Not a specific destination, not a ranch or a town or a set of people. She had walked toward the possibility of being actually somewhere, rather than conditionally everywhere. She had found it in a corner, not the corner she had asked George for in the Threadneedle that first desperate evening, but a corner nonetheless. A corner that had grown, through work and time and the willingness to stay when staying was hard, into something that held her weight. Outside, the September land lay in its last warmth before the cold came again. The creek ran where it had always run, through land that was now defended not just on paper but in practice, by people who understood what they had and had stopped taking it for granted. The kitchen garden along the south wall had given everything it was going to give this year, and in the spring it would give again, and the year after that, and Clara would be there to tend it. She put dinner on. In a few minutes the brothers would come in, one by one, in their various orders, and they would sit at the table they now sat at as people rather than as functions. And the evening would move through its ordinary stages, and when it was done, Clara would go to her room and take off her boots and set them beside the bed and sleep without them. The boots had been by the door for a long time. The running posture, the readiness. She was not running anymore. She was here. Not because someone had rescued her, not because the world had finally been kind, but because she had refused to let the hardest parts of her life determine the final shape of it. Because she had shown up at a broken house and done the work and stayed through the difficulty and built, with 6 imperfect men on a piece of unforgiving land, something that was real. That is the thing about people who have survived hard times. They do not emerge from them pure or undamaged or wise in the way that stories sometimes suggest. They emerge with scars and with habits that made sense once and don't always serve them now, with a tendency to hedge against trust and to sleep with their boots on. They emerge carrying things. But sometimes, not always, not for everyone, but sometimes, they also emerge with exactly the skills that the next place needs. The knowledge of what a house looks like when it starts to fail, the ability to read a document under pressure, the patience for the long and unglamorous work of keeping something alive. Clara Whitmore had all of those things. She used them here. And this, of all the places her difficult road had passed through, was where they found their use.